Alright, part 5 is now in session with Kenny the cat. Okay. It all begins with SpongeBob being very excited for Kenny to come to Bikini Bottom. Because he is his big fan. And he goes and tells Sandy about it, but Sandy becomes bitchy, and Sandy tells SpongeBob that Kenny is a complete fraud. But SpongeBob says she's just jealous because Kenny can hold his breath no matter what. And then later that night, SpongeBob and Patrick were excited for Kenny to come, and SpongeBob had gotten ready with this hideous looking cat face. Yeah, it's very hideous, guys. Patrick's like, this is creeping me out. And the next day, Kenny arrives, and everyone was like, oh my god, that's Kenny! And Kenny is holding his breath. And SpongeBob is very excited for Kenny, and Kenny is doing his best, holding his breath, and then later on, Kenny couldn't hold his breath any longer, and he went to the Krusty Krab bedroom. Yeah, Mr. Krabs hires him for whatever, and then he holds his breath, but after a while he couldn't hold it any longer, and he uses his breather so he can breathe a lot better. SpongeBob is now heartbroken because he found out that Kenny was a fraud. I'm sorry if I'm not explaining this very well, but I'm doing my best. Kenny's a fraud, and he tries to explain, and then SpongeBob listened to him and he agreed. And then Sandy comes to the picture and bitches about why animals can't breathe in the water any longer. And Kenny then turns out that he was a fraud all this time, and everyone was now against Kenny. And Mr. Krabs was like, "Oh, fuck you, Kenny," and he took the ketchups back in front of him, those small, tiny ketchups. And SpongeBob had said his goodbye to Kenny, and Kenny went up. And Sandy's like, you should never trust a cat. Or is it a dog? And yeah. This was a very cliche episode. Like, really. There's nothing interesting. I just find it to be very cliche and just poorly done, and it's just a very stupid episode. Sandy acted like a complete total bitch in this episode. She was very unlikable in this one. She acted like a complete total bitch. And SpongeBob with this ugly, that's really ugly, his cat look. That really makes it ugly. I don't know what the director was thinking when they said, oh, you know what, let's make this episode and fast forward and then release it to the public. It didn't do any good after that. So yeah, Kenny the Cat, such a poorly done episode, in my opinion. For number 13, I have the Cephalopod Lodge. It all begins when Squidward is minding his own business, being happy and all that stuff, and then he goes into the Cephalopod Lodge. Well, no other guess but him and his and other the other trustworthy guys in it. And then they saw the squid getting zapped by a jellyfish, and SpongeBob and Patrick, however, they were spying at him, and then they were following him, and then they cheered, and eventually they made Squidward get kicked out of the Cephalopod Lodge. They kicked him out for no reason. And Squidward's like, have you been dropped in your head when you were a fucking baby, SpongeBob? And they took his clothes and his underwear away from him, and his hat. That was one of the best things that Squidward really enjoyed, but yet they've been ruined by SpongeBob and Patrick. All the humanity. And then SpongeBob and Patrick want Squidward to join their club rather than the Cephalopod Lodge. Like, they were using the jellyfish by zapping their tongue, and it really hurted Squidward very much. Then they were the Feather Pals, or buddies. Squidward came to a point where, I don't want to be a fucking Feather Pal or a buddy. And then they find a way to make Squidward come back. And yeah, there was this one scene where SpongeBob and Patrick's like, it wasn't Squidward's fault. Yeah, it was Squidward's fault. And this guy's like, well, if it wasn't your fault, and if it wasn't Squidward's fault, then whose fault was it? And Patrick's like, maybe it's your fault. And he says, Squidward's never coming here ever again. That's really harsh. Squidward didn't do anything. Patrick, you're so dumb. Of course it's your fault. You and SpongeBob. So stop making up lies and tell the truth, for God's sakes. 'Cause you were the ones who done fucked up in the first place, not Squidward. It was you two. Confess it. It's your faults. Your faults. And then they figure out the way to make Squidward come back by being this sock monster, and Squidward goes in and defeats it, and SpongeBob and Patrick cheered, and they kick Squidward out again. And then Patrick uses Squidward's tongue for the jellyfish again, and Squidward screams, and that's basically the plot. It was a very dumb episode. Another one of those Squidward torture festivals. Man, you really feel sorry for poor old Squidward. All Squidward wanted was to join the club and be one of these guys. But SpongeBob and Patrick had to ruin it. SpongeBob and Patrick should have been kicked out instead. Squidward didn't do anything wrong, yet the directors thought it was Squidward's fault. The writers had no idea whose fault was it, when it was literally SpongeBob and Patrick's fault to begin with. And it was a very poor excuse for Squidward to get kicked out like that. Man, do I feel so sorry for Squidward. All he wanted was to have a good time, but he can't because of those two motherfuckers. Bottom line, this was a very mean-spirited and poor episode. Moving on. Number 12 is Rule of Dumb. Possibly one of the most mean-spirited episodes ever. This guy comes for Patrick, and Patrick freaks out and wants SpongeBob to hide from him because he thinks it's a librarian for his overdue books. When it was actually him that when he actually discussed him that he's the royal king and he's now king. But he doesn't make a good king. No, he's not a good king at all. He's a self-centered, arrogant son of a. He's too much of a self-centered, arrogant son of a bitch to be a king. He's too self-centered and he sometimes acts cold-hearted towards them. Like, he goes into the Krusty Krab because he was hungry. And then SpongeBob says to Mr. Krabs, everything you wanted, it's all free. And Mr. Krabs was like, fuck off! You have to buy in me restaurant. And then Patrick took this guy's lunch and he took most likely everything that belongs to other people. See what I mean? He's nothing but a self-centered, arrogant son of a bitch and a cold-hearted king. He doesn't care about anyone but himself. And then they were building a Ferris wheel, eventually taking Squidward's house away, moving it somewhere, and Squidward gets pissed off, and then saying that it's the worst thing. And he convinces him that Patrick is not a king. That was very well said, Squidward. Well said. Good job, Squidward. I knew I can count on you. Patrick is no king at all. He makes a lousy king to begin with. And then Patrick feels ostracized because he blames Squidward for everything. Because, yeah. And he yells at SpongeBob, and SpongeBob runs, and he sees himself as a monster, and then he runs away from it, and he takes the crown back, because he's freaked out. And now Gary is the king, the new king. This was a very mean-spirited episode. This was also the episode where Patrick had acted like this real monster to everyone by taking things away from them, not caring about anyone else, being selfish and greedy. That's awful. And the way that Squidward said Patrick was no king, I have to admit that was very well set up, Squidward. Because Patrick does not make a good king at all. Excuse me. He is like this monster that just like that we saw when we saw his reflection that he had what he had became. A monster. He's a monster. Bottom line, this was a very mean-spirited and insulting episode. And it was very offensive too. Part 6 will be in session, so stay tuned.